Hello again, everyone. I'm back with my review for the book Waking the Tiger. I did find it difficult to do this review, I'll admit. I think it took me a while to get through the material and really digest it. But I also procrastinated because I felt I wanted to give this book review its due respect, given the topic of trauma, and probably try and organize my thoughts for you guys. And what I've learned in the process of doing that is that I'm actually quite perfectionistic, which is most likely a trauma response. And I will attempt to try and transform that for you now in this review. So here it goes. Speaking of respect, I did appreciate very early on in the book how the author, Peter Levine, noted this himself and said, because trauma is the result of some of the most powerful drives within the human body, it demands respect. But I liked this understanding because he did acknowledge throughout the book how destructive the effects of trauma can be in a person's life and how it can ruin relationships. And he doesn't shrink for how debilitating that life experience can be and how trauma can destroy our lives if we let it. And I thought this was really real of him. And I totally agree, to be honest. And yet he conveys throughout the book that the understanding of trauma is one of the most common and natural things that we as humans can experience. And it can also be a real well or a source for self renewal, growth. I think he mentions it being a blessing at one point, even that can really enrich life. And now that I have that embodied sense of kind of transforming trauma through breathwork, I'm more of that understanding than I was prior to starting breathwork, or or maybe I would have been of that view before reading this book as well. Um, and I really like that grounded, reassuring definition of trauma that he has. And I think the idea of the result of a natural process gone awry would be forever seared in my mind, because it's just a reminder that we can just go back to nature and use animals as teachers to learn about trauma. And this is such a basic thing to do. And it really kind of takes the fear out of trauma for me, because I think my experience of trauma before was always quite negative and quite frightening. And like I said, destructive from what I witnessed in my life previously. And and using this idea of using animals as teachers, one image that kind of stands out for me is the image of the deer in a clearing where they become alert in anticipation of threat. Their muscles tense, their eyes and ears orient to the environment, and when there's no threat, their bodies just discharge this kind of built up energy by subtly twitching or vibrating until they relax again. And they might cycle through that maybe 100 times a day, just as a way of being. I think it's like proposes something that us humans can do to kind of regularly cycle in and out of activation and deactivation. Because I think a lot of the time when it comes to trauma, we're either stuck in one or the other. I also really liked learning about the triune brain. I never came across that before. With being termed as such, the neocortex, the mammalian brain, and the reptilian brain together. And I like to use that as an example, or an explanation rather, for why humans just don't do what animals do. And it's because of our highly evolved human brains, the neocortex can kind of override some of those kind of gentler instinctual responses that we're used to, but we might have just ignored over time. And they can kind of guide the healing of trauma, and help us discharge that kind of energy built up from it, like with the deer. Yeah, and I think trauma happens because of that instinctual cycle being cut short or not being able to finish. And because of this, that's why we're susceptible to trauma in the way that animals are not. But thankfully, as he kind of posits towards the end of the book, the way out of that for us humans is conscious awareness. We have conscious awareness of our inner experience, and we can access this through the body, through the felt sense. And this is where we can kind of get more in tune to those gentler responses. And I really liked learning about that. I thought it was a really simplistic, accessible way for us to kind of know how to get into the body. And when I was reflecting on the part of the book where he kind of determines who is traumatized or who isn't, it made me think of capacity for people and to be able to do this. So, for example, Levine notes who is traumatized by looking at the support the person might have in their lives, whether they can employ internal or external resources to meet the threat to their system, and the confidence that they have to do that, or if they're young kids and maybe they haven't learned skills yet from life experience, which makes me now understand how trauma can stem back to childhood for a lot of people. And then I thought about people who are not traumatized, and the book reinforced the power of community for me and our inherent need for our souls to belong and be nourished. On page 59, I think he says, many of us sense traumatic injury on the soul level. And I agree with them because I think that's how we communicate language or communicate about trauma in our language. We use kind of soulful words like heart, spirit, soul, loss of sense of self. And I think community can help people heal this hurt and come back to themselves. And through using kind of myth and telling stories and culture, people can develop that conscious awareness of the inner experience. And Levine even does it himself when he talks about Medusa, and how we can overcome trauma because we can work with its reflection. And I think when we kind of have that idea or story in our minds, it makes it easier to understand what that's about and makes it more tangible as well. And even the words like heaven and hell representing the expansion and constriction of the nervous system. And it's in the unification of those two that's where healing can take place. And something as powerful as those words have that huge historical legacy can really tap into the collective unconscious, I think, too. And breathwork sessions do that too. They touch on themes, they just use empowering language, mythical language. And I think for me, when I understand traumatized versus who isn't, maybe those people who aren't or who can heal have access to that language and community, and stories. And I couldn't help but think of the work I do in my job in suicide prevention in the community, reading this book, and how when I'm teaching about the topic, I give the research and the science and the theory and the evidence behind it, but I also give the space for the expression of what that soul experience is like for a person in suicidal distress. And I think that's what's needed, because then people really, really understand it thoroughly, in that embodied sense. And that's what we do as breathwork facilitators too. We know the science behind what's happening in the body on a biological level, but also we can communicate about it mythically and on a kind of philosophical level as well. And it strengthens the belief that we kind of need the integration of both, don't we? The science and soul for healing of trauma, the neocortex and the reptilian brain, the mind and body, the cognitive, the somatic, that kind of thing. So to conclude this review, because I know I'm running out of time, I think this book reminded me of something that Anthony mentioned to me at Breath Camp, about facilitating breathwork sessions, because I think I was a little bit nervous. And he said, you can't do it wrong. And this book actually confirmed this for me, because I think all the tenets about transforming trauma is what's in this book, basically, and that's what's in a breathwork session as well. In a breathwork session, we're kind of moving fluidly through activation, deactivation of the nervous system. We're creating a safe environment that people can orient to. We're going at someone's own pace, allow their bodies to gently speak their mind with their felt sense. We're giving them the opportunity to renegotiate trauma using the innate processes for healing within the body and any kind of images or mythical ideas that might emerge in the mind during a breathwork session. And we have the opportunity to reflect and build conscious awareness about this in the space for kind of integration afterwards. And of course, there's that sense of community of all of us doing this work, this healing, soulful work together. And I think it's transformation on that cellular level. And going off Levine's definition, the process of changing something in relation to its polar opposite, that's what transformation is all about, right? And once transformation occurs, Sorry, that was my timer. I think it harnesses the kind of powerful, positive energy in trauma, and we can use that to overcome it. And breath work, in my opinion, is the tool that builds the capacity within our bodies to be able to enable us to do that. Hope that makes sense. Thanks, everyone. Sorry it took so long.